So my name's Leanne, and today I'm going to be talking to you about dating shergottites using in-situ uranium-led geochronology, with a particular focus on trying to understand the microstructural and isotopic response of Baddeleyite to shock metamorphism. It helps if you start the presentation, doesn't it? So a little bit of Baddeleyite 101. Baddeleyite or monoclinic zirconia is an accessory phase typically within mafic and intermediate lithologies. And as such, it's quite a widespread phase within planetary materials. And like its silica saturated cousin zircon, it's an ideal uranium lead chronometer. So it takes in uranium, but largely excludes lead during its crystallization, making it a really good target for in situ uranium lead chronology. And Baddeleyite is pretty widespread within shergottites, particularly within enriched shergottites. And typically they form these kind of 5 microns or less crystals, like this example here. But if you're rare, if you're lucky, you'll get one of these rare 20 micron grains like this monster in Tinduf. But if we think about dating shergottites using Baddeleyite, one thing we do need to really understand is how robust uranium-lead isotopic compositions are to shock metamorphism. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So there's currently a little bit of a dichotomy between experimental studies and analyses of Baddeleyite within natural samples. With experimental studies, if we take this example from Nuhara et al., we use reference material Phallabora, what you find is that shock loading up to about 57 GPa doesn't result in any resolvable isotopic disturbance of these studied grains. And you have to push it up to well beyond your 900 degrees uranium lead closure temperature to begin to induce some isotopic mobility. However, when we look at some natural samples of Baddeleyite that have been shocked in terrestrial and Martian lithologies, we document partial to complete age resetting. And this example here that I'm going to be talking about, comparing most to in this talk, is highly shocked basaltic shergottite NWA 5298. And this recorded up to 80% lead loss within Baddeleyite ages. Importantly, what was observed was that if you look at the Baddeleyite microstructure, the microstructure is strongly linked to the degree of lead loss within 5298's Baddelyites, with the greatest lead loss reported within these highly shocked areas where we're seeing granular, i.e. recrystallized Baddelyites, and the most robust ages within Baddelyites that retain relic magmatic microstructures. Lead loss also was shown to be linked to transformation to and reversion from zirconia polymorphs, like we see in this phase diagram here. So briefly, at ambient conditions, monoclinic zirconia or Baddeleyite is stable, and as we shock load above about 3.3 GPa, we push into a series of orthorhombic zirconia polymorphs. With increased temperatures above about 1200 degrees, Baddeleyite undergoes martensitic phase transformation to tetragonal zirconia polymorphs, and with the greater PT conditions, we push into cubic polymorphs. Baddeleyite is very refractory, so at ambient pressures, you need to really hit about 2700 degrees to physically melt your Baddeleyite. So importantly, we can track this phase heritage because these polymorphs are metastable within natural samples. And we can use electron backscatter diffraction, or EBSD, to do this. And this is because as your polymorph reverts, it forms these monoclinic domains linked by systematic orientation relationships that mirror the polymorph, that mirror the symmetry of the parental polymorph. So you can see when we revert from orthorhombic polymorphs or tetragonal polymorphs, we'll find these 3 distinct clusters of monoclinic zirconia linked by orthogonal orientation relationships. And as we go multi-stage reversion history from cubic polymorphs, we'll find orthogonally orientated 320-degree crosses. So as you can see from this figure here, we actually cannot distinguish using EBSD from orthorhombic and tetragonal reversion, as they form the same pattern on our pole figure. However, most areas of shergottites won't have seen significant shock melting, and so they won't have experienced probably greater than 1200 degrees centigrade. So I think we can be fairly confident in saying we're looking dominantly at reversion from orthorhombic polymorphs. And this is important that we track this phase heritage because we know that obviously within 5298, this is strongly linked to degree of lead loss and also within terrestrial samples. However, as you heard earlier, NWA 529 is actually on the very higher shock end of shergottites, particularly in terms of post-shock temperatures. So what role does phase reversion affect uranium lead isotope systematics within more moderately shocked shergottites? And to what degree can Baddeleyite ages be reset within these lithologies? So that's what we're going to investigate today. And to do this, I've looked at a number of shergottites, but I'm going to focus on 4. And we're going to look at, I'm going to talk about NWA 7257, NWA 8679, and Zagami. And these have bulk shock characteristics very typical of most shergottites, including pervasive fracturing, PDFs, complete transformation of plagioclase to dialectic glass, and localized shock melting in the form of shock pockets. 8679 and Zagami also have some very thin lanelets of shock melt running through, but we didn't notice these in 7257. And then we'll go to something a little bit more shocked, which is Tintu 002, which is a purported low mass pair of NWA 8656. And you can see that in areas, it looks like the 3 aforementioned shergottites, but we also see greater degrees of shock melting with the vesiculation of plagioclase melt and the beginnings of recrystallization of these melted areas. So this sample is kind of transitional between 7257, 8679 Zagami and 5298. So Baddeleyite is pretty widespread within these lithologies. These are all enriched shergottites, and as you heard, you can find hundreds of grains per thin section within these, particularly within basaltic shergottites like 8679 and Zagami. And I think one really important point is to state that these are definitively late magmatic phases. There's no link with shock melt areas, and they're commonly associated with iron titanium oxides, phosphates, and mesostasis mescalinite. So what we did is we took these grains and we did EBSD on the grains that were big enough to potentially go on and date. And I'm going to, in the next few slides, characterize these into 4 distinct microstructural groupings on the basis of their EBSD microstructures. I just wanted to note this now, there's a caveat that these are a continuum of microstructures, so these groupings shouldn't be considered absolute. And we actually see very widespread microstructural variability, and sometimes within an individual Baddeleyite too. So rarely we find these lovely, beautiful Baddelyites that have actually not undergone transformation to orthorhombic zirconia polymorphs. And we see this because they have simple orientation relationships indicative of magmatic twinning. This one has an 180-degree rotation in the 001. The only evidence of shock is about 12 degrees of crystal plastic deformation and a kind of like degraded crystallinity, which we can see here as darker areas within our band contrast. And these grains really are a testament of the shock heterogeneity that shergottites experience, because these things haven't seen more than about 5 GPa of shock pressure, even though we'd argue for a bulk shock pressure of about 30 GPa for the complete transformation of plagioclase to mescalinite. So I'm just going to keep this schematic up here, which shows kind of increased transformation. And the first, and at low temperatures, we begin to see the most abundant microstructural grouping, which is our quasi-amorphous grains. And these are marked by a significant decrease in crystallinity in our band contrast, with localized areas of indexing separated out by areas that diffraction length scales below EBSD analysis, which for us is about 50 nanometers. And similarly reported microstructures were reported in 5298 in the Darling et al. Paper. And actually TEM lift-outs of these do show nanostructural ordering. So I think we'll see these are truly quasi-amorphous structures. And we form these by partial to complete transformation of orthorhombic zirconia polymorphs, but rapidly reverting them at low post-shock temperatures. This inhibits significant nucleation of monoclinic zirconia and produces the quasi-amorphous structures we see. So if we push up to slightly higher post-shock temperatures, I've just split these in 2 for ease of comparison. We find where partial transformation occurs, a dominant magmatic Baddeleyite orientation. This one doesn't show twins, it's just got a single simple orientation, with these exterior domains of monoclinic zirconia linked by these orthogonal orientation relationships. And what we're seeing here is partial transformation to orthorhombic zirconia polymorphs and reversion at temperatures sufficient to nucleate micron scale reverted domains. And we occasionally see this for the entire grain also. This is an example in NWA 879. Unfortunately, this one wasn't big enough to date. But what you see is the entire grain shows these distinct monoclinic clusters with orthogonal orientation relationships. And this is complete transformation of your grain and reversion at temperatures sufficient to nucleate significant micron scale monoclinic zirconia. So these are our 4 groupings. So if we put these together, this is what we see. Sorry for the pie charts. NWA 7257 and Zagami are dominated by grains with quasi-amorphous structures. And we see throughout all of our studied shergottites that actually reversion is really widespread. Kind of untransformed grains are the least abundant within all of our studied samples. And the dominance of quasi-amorphous structures within 7257 and Zagami is really indicative of low post-shock temperatures, which ties in with what we know for Zagami, which has had calculated post-shock temperatures lower than about 220 degrees C. 8679 is a little bit different. We see a kind of less transformation to our orthorhombic zirconia polymorphs, but at sufficient post-shock temperatures to nucleate micron scale baddeleyite. So even though these are at apparent comparable PT conditions from our usual diagnostic mineral features, we can actually pick out nuances of the shock metamorphism from baddeleyite. And tin 2, as expected, being a higher PT shergottite, shows a lot of transformation to these orthorhombic polymorphs, and particularly where associated with high degrees of shock melting, we're seeing significant nucleation of reverted monoclinic zirconia. Now, if we take our natural samples and we take what we've seen in NWA 5298, what we might expect to find is that our magmatic baddelyites hold on to their most robust uranium isotopic compositions, and we might begin to see partial lead loss within these quasi-amorphous grains. But because we've done the phase heritage investigation into phase heritage, we can assess what we're looking at when we look at our uranium lead concordia. However, if we plot our uncorrected analyses on these Terra-Wasserberg plots, what you see is that every single one of our samples forms a very nice discordia, which within cogenetic samples like this is indicative of closed system uranium lead isotopic behavior. And we find that microstructure actually bears no resemblance, so there's no link between microstructure and the uranium lead isotopic composition of our studied baddelyites. And in fact, the spread that we see along the discordia is simply overlap with surrounding phases when we date these using the SIMS. We have to use a 5 micron focused ion beam, and particularly within those basaltic shergottites, they can be a little bit smaller than that. So yeah, that's where we're at. And there is a little bit of scatter around the base of the concordia. We know that baddeleyite is a bit adept to orientation effects on the SIMS. We are oxygen flooding, which doesn't completely negate, but does dampen these effects. And the fact that Zagami sits slightly to the left for this most radiogenic point of the diatel data does indicate that we've seen the orientation effects but haven't analysed enough grains to even it out. So we have really very nicely formed discordia with upper intercepts indicating the common lead isotopic compositions of our sample. There's a distinct terrestrial flavour to A679 and tin 002, so comparable with what was shown previously in 5298, where there is a mix of common lead isotopic reservoirs, probably overlapping with fractures in these grains. And our lower intercepts represent our crystallization ages, which give us a range between about 185 to 220 MA for A679. The fact that tin sat on a discordia was a little bit of a shock for me, particularly when we look at some of the more heavily shock grains within that sample. This is the one we saw at the start. And you can see that while it's not indexing across the entire grain, where it does index, we get these orthogonal orientation relationships indicative of reversion from orthorhombic zirconia. But we're also beginning to see these underformed crystallites with these random orientations. And this is actually indicative of nascent recrystallization. So it's just that these effects still aren't playing, even though these effects are there, and we know that they are causing low mobility with 5298. This indicates that at the length scales of Sims analysis, so 5 microns, we're evening out these effects. That our moderately shocked shergottites sit on a Discordia must indicate that the post-shock temperatures they experienced were insufficient to induce significant lead mobility. And given that we're seeing grains that actually look broadly comparable to those that we see in 5298, also suggests that probably the longevity of post-shock heating is also playing a role here. So this is really great news for dating shergottites using Baddeleyite, because 757, 8679 and Zagami are very comparable in kind of bulk shock, in the bulk shock pressures and temperatures they've experienced to most other shergottites. Although we still want to do electron backscatter diffraction of our Baddeleyite so that we fully quantify and understand the data. We fully have contextualized uranium-lead isotopic information. We also present a bit of a resolution here to the dichotomy between experimental studies and natural samples, because we do see widespread reversion from our orthorhombic zirconia polymorphs, which indicates that just simply the duration of shock loading within experimental studies, which is an order of magnitude less than natural samples, is insufficient to form these transformation and reversions. So just to leave you with my conclusions, we document widespread reversion from orthorhombic zirconia and shergottites. This is expected. It takes about 5 GPa to eject shergottites from the Martian surface. But critically, and in contrast to our higher shocked samples, we don't observe a link between Baddeleyite microstructure and uranium-lead isotopic compositions, suggesting that we need significant post-shock heating and probably longevity of post-shock heating to induce lead mobility resolvable by Sims analysis. Just to bring this in with why Baddeleyite might be useful for sample return, every single one of the analyses I've shown you have come from a single thin section. So we can do petrographic characterization and provide contextualized chronology within a very low mass, at very low masses. So yes, Baddeleyite is a really interesting and exciting mineral for dating shock planetary materials, and where these shock characteristics can and Baddeleyite microstructures indicate low post-shock temperatures, Baddeleyite is a really useful tool for dating the crystallization age of the rock you are looking at. And that's me, so I'll happily take any questions.
Great, thanks, Leanne. That was awesome. Does anyone have any questions at this stage? I mean, I guess the obvious question would be then, can we just blat any old Baddeleyite and get magmatic crystallization ages?
I guess in the 4 studied samples, we're getting away with it, but I would argue that, I mean, we saw in 8679 that even though it looks the same as all the other shergottites, that it has got a different shock history in the Baddeleyite microstructure. So just because it looks the same doesn't necessarily mean it's held on to its uranium-lead compositions as well. So I would always do EBSD. I may be slightly biased, but I think, yeah, having as much context as possible is the best way to do these sorts of measurements. So
great. Is there anyone else that wants to chip in at this stage?
I have a quick question.
Please do.
Yeah, so how often you find Baddeleyite on all of that Martian meteorite? Well, this is great. Thank you for the great talk.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
So yeah, within Martian meteorites, Baddeleyite is really abundant within enriched. I did recently find an enriched shergottite that was apparently lacking in Baddeleyite, which was a bit of a shock to me. But yeah, so it kind of tallies with mantle source domains. So depleted shergottites have the least abundance, intermediates have a moderate number per thin section, and enriched, which is Zagami in 8679, we use feature analysis and it picks up hundreds of grains. Okay. And we know that there's Baddeleyite in the breccias as well. Not sure about the kind of, I know I didn't find it in the algite basalts, but I don't know about some of the more moderately aged ones. But
yeah,
okay,
I could just add to that. the AGU monograph, James, help me the name of it. But anyway, microstructural geochronology we have a chapter in there about it, and there are different factors, but a lot of it is really the evolution of the melt. So you have to have it evolved.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's more common in the enriched ones, but yeah, if the melt is more evolved, gets to the later crystallization where you can build up enough zirconium to produce Baddeleyite, then you'll get it. There's other factors, but yeah, so the olivine ferric shergottites don't tend to have them. That's the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there was another question, James, in the chat.
Yes, there is. So the question is, which instrumentation did you use to do dating on a 5-micron scale?
So we used Kamika IMS 1280 Microprobe in Heidelberg. There's with Axel Schmidt there's a lot of history and Baddeleyite dating there, so they're very good.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks, Leanne. We're more or less on time, so we'll try and stick to that and move on.